Time for us to begin this morning, and so if you would go ahead and get yourselves settled as we kind of step back into our study today. Remember, we've partially shifted a little bit where our initial classes were heavily map focused and building our own personal copies, being kind of like dime store cartographers and trying to make sure we've drawn all those things. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but before we get into our study, let's pause, reflect, and pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the blessing that comes with your word and your Son. Help us as students and disciples to grow our faith and to more deeply appreciate what you have done for mankind and for us as individuals. Help us to be faithful and to see heaven. And we offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. And I want to go a little bit more in detail about the value of that cartography experiment. We're not truly cartographers, but we do live in the adjacent edge when we do that kind of work. It's very simple. If you talk to someone who has tried to learn something difficult, one of the tasks that they say typically helps us is taking our hand, picking up a pencil or a pen, and just writing down the information. If you have to memorize a bunch of facts, if you have to create flashcards, if you have to remember a list of things to do, you're almost always better writing it out than you are typing it or having someone give you a list and say, remember these things. And that doesn't mean it's easy. It's just that it's better. And so that methodology is a little bit better. And I say that knowing that for many of us, the map stuff is like, oh, that's like getting extra bran in my diet. I know I need to, but maybe I don't want to. But there's a value in the end to it, that it actually does help us. Now, that was our first step. And so we had a nice fiber-rich diet to begin with. We're going to continue to go back to it from time to time, but now we've shifted towards thinking more about the general history. So in a certain sense, this is now surveying the information that goes on top of those maps. And right now we're using what's called map number 6. We've used it the last couple of weeks. We'll still use it a little bit as well as we think about some of the things that take place historically, predominantly in the text of Numbers, although it goes all the way into, for today hopefully, into the segment that kind of includes the pre-conquest information in Joshua. So that's Joshua 5 verse 12 is kind of the end cap for this section. And we think about the text of Numbers, and immediately what does your brain do when you say Numbers? Census comes in. For some of us, me who are like, I need to know things, my brain goes, Numbers. That's also nap time, because it feels like this boring story. But you guys remember what the alternative title is for Numbers that's common in the Jewish scriptures? Wilderness. Kind of neat that way. Does that sound a little more exciting? It actually is. Well, at least it is to me. Like if you say, hey, I got 2 books for you to read. You can either read Numbers or the wilderness. Well, you know which one I'm going to pick every time, right? I want the wilderness. I want that. I want to have those kind of interactions. It doesn't mean the information changed, but it does mean that maybe we have improperly assigned content and our opinion on the basis of the exciting or boring titles, because it still has censuses. It still has a lot of other things going on. It still has long lists of names that are hard to read and all of those things. But there's a different story going on underneath it. In addition to that, there is a historical shift that takes place. Most of this text is actually pretty sad, because they're waiting, in essence, for an entire generation to reach the end of their journey. You start thinking about that, the driving mechanic of these things. because they're going to wander around this wilderness as they wait for all this to take place. Now, we'll go back and have some details in a second. But when you think about this wilderness experience, what are some of the top things that come to your mind about what happens to Israel, God's people, those who are striving with or against God at different points in their existence? What kind of ideas come forth? What happens to them? What are you thinking about? What's going on? Yeah, so we have a couple of these events with how God feeds them and cares for them. Some of it is involving their complaining. Oh, manna. Manna again? Do you guys relate to that when you start reading the text? Okay. I read this recently, and probably a couple years ago, a first time, where folks were talking about, if I had known that a major portion of my adult life was going to be figuring out what we needed to eat each week, I probably would have done things differently. But you think about that. How many of your conversations at home are like, hey, what are we going to have on the menu next week? And the answer is, I don't know. We commiserate with that. We understand it to a degree. There are also some theological things going on here underneath that, though. This is not just a practical, this meal isn't any good and it doesn't taste good, because that's our first layer of it. But it's also about who their God is. When they talk about wanting to go back to Egypt and have the big pots, big vats of those food, realize that in all cultures that surround Israel, it's a conflict of a God to disciple relationship. And so going back to Egypt isn't just to go back to the restaurants that are there, but it's also returning to the system of their gods and their enslavement. And so they wanted to go back, and they would rather be slaves in Egypt than eat this manna. That, by the way, God was giving them with a minimal effort involved. Just go out and pick it up. Just go out and gather it up. And then gather up a little extra on one day. And God was providing for them in substance and quantity of necessary. What else is going on besides the manna? That's going to reappear a couple of times. It also becomes part of the conversation of Christ while he's upon the earth. The Red Sea event that gets them there. I also think about 40 years and their clothing doesn't wear out. Everything just takes, it's like everything is sustained or cared for in that context. And there's no problems with it. There's no difficulties. Everything's good. And you start thinking about that even more so in that setting. God is continuing to provide for them. He cares for them first with protection, before, after, and in the middle of the Red Sea experience. He cares with them physically with food. He cares for their clothing. He cares for their water. And he is going to provide for them a law, an understanding of relationship. Because this generation doesn't actually know God in any way that we can understand or read from the Scriptures. They have no system of worship that we're aware of. They are enslaved in Egypt, and their spokesman of what God wants them to do, Moses, Aaron, is slowly revealing the depth of relationship that they will have. It doesn't mean that they wouldn't have known that God existed and all those other factors, but there's no knowledge of them having a structured way to approach their God. They don't have an intimate knowledge of their God. And so very quickly in their journey, as they go through the various edges and spaces of that dry wilderness experience, you can see some images up there, and I've got a few more for this week and next week that will help you visualize some of those settings. Very quickly, their behavior is, well, let's start to complain. Let's grumble and murmur. Let's make this more and more problems. And it is at that location where they end up in such deep complaint that they invoke the emotions of God. it's not classically a human emotion, but they're always written that way, that God's love, wrath, and experience. So the reason I say it's not a classic human emotion is that we live down here and God lives up there. And we are shown to be similar to him in the way that he feels, but we are never shown to be the same. And so we need to make sure we're very careful that we don't do a very dangerous thing where we ascribe our sense of emotions to him, because that's the wrong direction. Our sense of emotions are a reflection of his, and so the direction flows the other way. But those are the words we get to use. Those are the only words we have to use to describe this, and he is so bothered, so upset at their murmuring, their complaining, their rebellious and cantankerous attitude, that those who are on the edge of the camp suffer for their own rebellion. Those are the choices that they made. And this has them working their way down into what would be the lower portion of the Sinai Peninsula in this wilderness area, into one of the multiple possible sites for this event to take place. And we get the structure of how this is going to play out. As they go on, just a few miles further, we get another stack of complaints. Tired of manna. Not only do they want the pots, they want cucumbers and melons and everything else that you could find in Egypt. He sent quail and a plague. So they got what they wanted, but they got a little bit more. Now, this is a reflection of the relationship they're going to have with God. The covenant context, every covenant that God institutes in the Old Testament text, and it's replicated in the New Testament text, is typically read or structured in a vassal structure relationship. You have a lord, and then you have someone who is bequeathing something to those who are servants. And they have a blessing and a cursing of some kind or another. And so you think about how this goes. God's full covenant with Israel included a long list of blessings, right? But was there an equally long list of curses?
Longer.
Yeah, the curses could have been longer and more specific. And there was a variety of them attached to a branching, if you will, where a blessing may have had multiple possible curses. And so God's response to the murmuring as it inches along started with one thing, it expanded, and finally you get to the location of the Kibroth Hatava, which is the location where the plague arrived. This is post the quail delivery, and you start thinking about that. We already had stage one, where God's giving them manna every day, providing them sustenance sufficient for all of them. And they complain and they complain. They want this, they want that. So God gives them quail as their solution. And that solution then ends with them also having new consequences. Now you get this, but here's your consequence. Here's the outcome. Here's the awfulness. Finally, they will arrive in the spot that is called Wilderness of Paran, more broadly. But this is now Kadesh Barnea. It's 50 miles from the Promised Land as they kind of work their way up. And this is where our spies will go out. They're going to eventually make their way over and into the Promised Land from this location. And if you want to look at it on a map, we'll do that in a second. They come back with a mixed response, right? So, you guys remember how the spies, the seekers, the investigators came back from the Promised Land, from Canaan? What did they have with them?
Buckets of grapes.
How big does the text present those grapes to us? Strangely large, right? Absurdly large from our experiences. Now keep in mind, there's a couple of things that frame our perspective of grapes. How many of you have raised grapes at your house? I've raised them in our backyard. We actually had a whole grapevine in Tennessee for a long time. And our grapes don't get, at least in Tennessee, they did not do very well. It was not the right environment for them. And so you're not seeing these big bunches of grapes growing up. If anything, you got just little globules. But let's put some context on it. What has been their diet for 40 years, or for a number of years up to this point? Manna, quail, manna, quail, manna, quail. What are grapes going to look like if that's all you've eaten for a while? They're probably going to look like the best grapes you've ever seen, because they may be the only grapes you've ever seen. For some of them, that could have been legitimately the case. And then we added the fact that these are now coming from a land that God is blessing for them. And so you get these huge bunches of grapes. So far, they're shown as carrying them back on poles. Very typical way to carry harvested grapes that you've gotten from the field in those areas. And they come back with a report that says, look at how great this is. But there's a catch. Come back with a story of, there are literal giants in the land. So much so we are absolutely terrified. We don't think we can take it. Now, that's an interesting kind of connection on these things, because those of the first generation who bounced off of the promised land because of their rebellion had seen what God can do for them. They had seen the power of God's angels protecting them. They had seen the crossing and walked on the crossing of the Red Sea. They had been present for all of those things. But that's not this generation of people. They hadn't seen those things. There's actually not that much difference between this generation and the generation that was on the edge the first time, right? Behaviorally, they're about the same. Oh, we can't do it. It's not going to happen. We don't have the ability. So, 10 spies, but 2 spies, along with Moses and Aaron, bring back this good report. They're the ones who are going to be our bridge between the two groups, right? The groups that eventually will come in, and this group that's bouncing off the edge. They get there, Moses included, and they're not going to come in. This sets the stage up for them to loop or wander, if you will, in the promised land's edges and corners. This wilderness wandering space, which you can see up here, is just a large area of places you don't want to live. You think about what's going on there. No water, no real towns, no fortifications, no trade routes, nothing of immediate value to a nomadic people. And much like maybe you and I, they get upset when they realize that God is upset with them. You think about how you've behaved when you kind of knew you were doing the wrong thing, but then you get called out on it, and you all of a sudden go, I got to make this right. I got to fix this. Israel's behavior is kind of like that, where they're obviously engaged in rebellious attitudes, and then they're called out on it. Like, oh, what? We can do this. Of course we can do this, because we are going to make it happen. And they rush to that first village, but Moses had already given them a warning. You're not going to make it out. You're not going to survive. And they center themselves then around Kadesh Barnea. And I've got a photo here that I was going to show, one of many here. This one right here gives you an illustration of what that area looks like. How many guys are ready to go exciting on a nice little hike through the wilderness area around Kadesh Barnea? You guys want to go? I haven't been to this corner myself. I've been near it in other areas that are very similar. But I've been told it bears a lot of similarity to our U.S. Death Valley area. where basically nothing grows. There's no sustainable water supply. And I remember when I was a kid going to that Death Valley National Park, what you would do is you would get 4 or 5 extra gallons of water so that you could keep filling your radiator as you drove into the park, because your car was just going to completely evaporate it off because of the pressure, the heat, and the temperature. And so you refilled your radiator to successfully make it to the park, and then you refilled it again on the way out. So that gives you an idea of the context of what you see going on here. This is where God is placing them. Moses, though, picks up what in essence is the same kind of behavior. He engages in something that I think most of us can also connect to on an emotional level, but it's also important for us to understand it on a spiritual side. You ever been frustrated with the people that you are nominally or actually in charge of, so much so that their bad behavior becomes your bad behavior? You ever been through that experience? I think most of us probably have, where we kind of pick up on they're not doing what's supposed to be, so now I'm upset with them because I was told to get them to do a thing. There's a bit of that here with Moses. It's not that Israel is to blame, but he's in the cauldron with them now. He's boiling with them. And here's something to remember. In the New Testament, Paul makes a broad assertion regarding the impact of the people around you. He says that, how do companions affect us? When Paul writes to the Christians at Corinth.
Bad ones corrupt you.
Yeah. Evil companions will corrupt your good morals. Now, while that is not just like the rest of Proverbs in the Old Testament, it's not an absolute that if you leave a good man with bad men, eventually that good man turns bad. It does tell you that in general, they will influence you. Even the best of them. Moses is often seen as one of the best hearts in the Old Testament, right? Would you say that's probably pretty fair? He's obedient, he's trusting, he's not perfect, but his effort is always there. And yet, he doesn't enter in the promised land. There's a spot on the Jordanian side of this portion of the Middle East where you can stand, and it's in the possible range of mountains where they would have been at. And you can see the promised land there. And on a clear day, which is rare because it's very dusty, you can see all the green that surrounds the Jordan. So even just calculating the small time, relatively speaking, that it would have been for Israel to walk to there and have God provide for them. And then you get to there and you can see the oasis. You can see what would become eventually the city of palms. You could see the verdant green that would surround the Jordan. You could see that God's blessings were present there. And you're like, no, you're not going in. That level of heartbreak has to be high, because consider what he has tried to accomplish. And yet he does not go in. Joshua and Caleb, though, will. And they are unique in that sense. They have a special place. And so they will eventually work their way into what will become, as we note, the promised land. And so they are going to kind of swirl around for a while. And they are told and instructed in particular, though, that these lands that they are sojourning through, they're not for them. Edom, not their land. That's going to have a peculiar effect on the relationships, right? As the nation of Israel is moving through, and there's a lot of them, and the typical behavior of the nations around there is, hey, if you bring a big herd of people coming in, you're not just passing through. Nations don't migrate in that regard. They conquer. And so they are coming into these various subgroup nations around them, reasonably so, the nations that are next to him, hey, why are you here? What exactly is your purpose here? Do they believe Moses and Israel when they say we're just a passing through? No. They have every reason to think that they are being deceptive. It doesn't matter whether we know. Helps us understand their context. And if you have this large nation going there, you're going to put up walls, you're going to put out the army, you're going to feel like they're going to be after you, you're going to move in every way possible. And so you see in these stories, in this middle space, that the nations around them end up following into about 2 baskets. A third one appears when they move into the conquest phase. Basket number 1, hey, we should make treaties. Uniformly, the nations that try to make treaties with Israel are smaller than they are. And their method of treaty in that region is we should marry together so that we become one people. That's how it was performed. That's how those treaties took place. You'll take wives and husbands from us and vice versa, and then we'll all be the same, and we can't really fight each other because you're not going to fight against your own kinfolk, right? The other solution is, we're going to war. We're bigger than you. You're coming through. Not only do we not want you there, we want your stuff. And we want you gone. Those are the 2 solutions that are most commonly present in history, but also present here. But with that, they are kind of pushed around, and they move forward to what is Mount Hor. They're waiting for a message from Edom. This is where Aaron dies, up in this area. 123 years old. That's Numbers 33 and verse 38. Because of those edge conflicts, though, the Israelite soldiers are going to retaliate against a Canaanite king who came and took some captives, doing what the nations around them would do. The place is then called Hormah at that point. So now we have them kind of branching up through these areas. Kind of see roughly what's going on as they move. They're not able to go south. That would put them back into Edom or into, in particular, Ezion Gezer or Gaber. They had to go northeastward through a terrible land to make their way northward. They're going just east of the Dead Sea. We're not exactly sure where that route is, but it's just in that space. So you can kind of see up here in the upper section. There we go. Up in this area. So they're going to eventually move themselves through this area. Now realize that these spots here, this is not any better per se most of the time than the wilderness area of the Sinai Peninsula. This is still southern Israel. It's still very rain dependent. Mostly inhabited by shepherds who can move their herds from water hole to water hole. There's no place really to provide for a sustained city or community outside of the trade routes. And so with that movement that they're going on, they once again complain. Now you would think at this point, rationally considered, that they would have learned a lesson about complaining about what God's doing, right? How many times, offhand, have they complained and had a negative consequence with God? Anytime more than once is kind of making a point, right? But I want you to think about this. From 1937 to 1945, the Japanese military engaged in an ongoing series of what we would call war crimes and atrocities against all of their neighbors across the board. Uniformly taking massive numbers of lives from China and the surrounding regions. In just one incident, early in World War II, one of the towns right on the edge of the Chinese zone that was then occupied by Japan lost 300,000 of its residents over the course of about 3 months. And you would think that folks would learn lessons about stuff like that, right? That maybe there's consequences to that level of atrocity. They didn't care. They continued engaging that behavior, even as the Allied forces were inching their way across the island groups and moving forward and continually making it to, hey, this is, you're not going to win the war. You should actually surrender. There are going to be consequences to your behavior. Even up to the end of World War II, the Japanese military was totally okay with their behavior, their rebellion, totally okay with taking all those lives. And even after they were called for unconditional surrender, like, no, we got this. We're totally okay with fighting it out. Even after they dropped the first nuclear bomb, they weren't ready to surrender at that point. And it was only after the second one that some of them were okay with it. Don't get the idea that these modern humans are any different than humans from the biblical era. I can't fathom what it would be like to be on the outskirts of a city that had a nuclear weapon dropped on it. Can't even imagine it. Although there are people living who could tell me what it was like still. That number's diminishing. But many of them have all kinds of interesting or strange views as to what all that happened and how they feel about it. Israel, full of people who had seen God's power, who had seen God's justice, who had seen God's wrath, is full of people just like you and me. And even in spite of seeing all those things, they engage in behavior contrary to their commitment to the covenant, their commitment to God, and they complain once again. It's important to kind of make these real life connections. Hey, this is not that different than you and me. Their behavior, we're certainly potential. And if you were to go survey our own social media and the things we've posted over the years, how many of the things that you've posted publicly are complaints about something or other? I think that's one of our greatest skills as humans to our detriment, is we can complain like champions. Hopefully our complaints are minimal and not involving our God and our King. But sometimes they can feel that way. If you want even more details of that, go read through the Psalms and see how the inspired text of the Bible records the complaints of humanity. Some of those are very opening to our own moral states at times. Their camping kind of continues from there at places entitled Zama'ah, Hunan, Oboth, and Lebaim. Those are all somewhere on the border of Moab. But they are still within what would be considered the jurisdiction of Edom at that time. Edom's power went far enough in those areas. And so we have them kind of moving this way through the events as they inch their way up and into this final point of presentation. They're going to go by, this is kind of the last stepping stages of this here in a second. From Mount Nebo as our central point, they're going to cross over a couple of things. Remember, these are the rivers we learned early on that border Israel. The short version of Jaz, that's from north to south, if you can remember the letters that start each of them. But this is the Arnon and the Zered River that are two tributaries to the Dead Sea. And this is going to be like kind of an edge space that will have a number of other events taking place here as well. But after crossing the Zered River, they're on the edge of the land right there between the Moabites and the northern sections. God said they could not have their land, and they moved north on Moab's outer fringes, right across the Arnon River. And in this spot here, another group of people we have to kind of pay attention to that will show up are the Ammonites, or Ammonites. They're going to show up later in conflict spaces as one of the groups that Israel will fight on either of its sides. Shihon of the Ammonites control the territory in this area between the Jabbok River and the Arnon River. His army would come out against Moab, and Moses would lead the army of Israel to victory. They would conquer King Og, and this would become a portion of the land deeded out to the people of Israel later. This would be a separate section that will create part of our narrative thinking about their history in the future. Let's go forward from this. Remember, Sihon had driven them out of that fertile edge, and this is where the descendants of Lot would be found. They became, like I pointed out, a constant source of conflict. Mostly because they wanted what those fertile lands afforded. All right, so our next spot of this is to think more about of Moab again, and we find Balak, one of the many uses of the name Balak, by the way. He's afraid to attack the Israelites, so he tries another approach. So this is our one of two options. Doesn't want to attack them, we got to find something else. He sent for a prophet, and the prophet's name is Balaam, and he wants to curse the Israelites. Balaam comes, right? Is he any good at cursing the Israelites? Yeah, if you wanted to use one of those, you had one job memes, that's where this would fit. You had one job. He was paid to prophesy woe regarding the Israelites, and he is an absolute failure at that job. He's also an absolute failure at listening to his animals. So he doesn't do that well either. Balaam advised Balak to tempt Israel to sin, and God himself would curse them. It's actually a more reasonable response. Kind of gets him out of the problem. You see a little cunning and trickery on Balaam's side. Balak would send a Moabite and Midianite women into the Israelite camp, trying to entice them to sin. That's an image that's repeated in the text of Judges. You think about Samson, and this is that same kind of temptation presented. But what's interesting is that, remember, what is Ruth's heritage?
Moabite.
She's Moabite. And who is she a progenitor of?
Jesus.
Jesus, yeah. So there's an interesting turning of events. If you wanted to make a long-standing note, this is a good place for us to place it in history. When man tries to manipulate the events and tries to entice people to sin or engage in this kind of rebellion, it never works. It never does. But generally, at some point after that kind of event, God seems to take that same kind of circumstance and just flip it. And the technical term is subvert it, to tell us a story of redemption. And so man's attempt to use man for rebellion fails, but God's reminder of redemption sustains. So each of these subverted stories end up showing us that God is graceful to the nations that surround him, including Moab, including Nineveh, including Egypt. God's grace goes to them and through them in spite of their obvious rebellion. God would demand that the guilty ones be put to death, and so 24,000 succumbed to this short-lived rebellion. But their goal is not sustained. They don't get rid of the Israelites this way. All that happened is further complications for them, Moab, and a cleansing, if you will, of part of Israel. God then sends the army to fight the Midianites and the Moabites for vengeance because of the mess that they had made. Deuteronomy as a text is made up of what is in essence the series of speeches that Moses makes on the plains of Moab. It is a companion to Leviticus, not a retelling of Leviticus. Because we often kind of figure out, what do we do with these things? And one of the most powerful sections of Deuteronomy is the Shema, which starts in chapter 6. And so as you're reading through chapter 6, maybe verses 1 through 10, you can really, actually all the way back in chapter 4 through chapter 6, you're going to see one of the most powerful sections of the speaking of Moses. Now remember, Moses is the one who did not feel he was eloquent or adequate to speak to Israel for God. And then go back and reread what Moses actually says to Israel for God, and you'll figure out, I don't think he's very good at estimating his potential. And I think that probably makes the same thing for all of us. Let's pause right here and do something we haven't done in a while, in part because we've got about 3 minutes left, but also because it's time. And surveying your thoughts regarding the wilderness narrative and everything back to Genesis if you want to. What are some of these sections that you liked? When you read through the parts of the Bible and you started thinking about the history of God's people, what'd you like? What'd you not like? What would you like to know more about? Our standard 5 questions are coming back into play. So what'd you guys like? Michael?
I like that the shoes didn't wear out. And when you think about things that God cares about and takes care of us, even those small details are important.
Yeah. That's a highly self-reflective thing. When it's very difficult for me to find clothes that fit myself or my children, I'm absolutely in favor of buy once and never have it wear out again. Seems a really good plan to me. But also in the sense of God's care. It actually really is the backdrop for what Jesus says on the Mount. That God cares. He cares at you to a level superior to nature. What else? Anything else interesting? Les?
I like when they finally surrendered to the idea of God to take care of them, and they were willing to go into battle and trust Him.
Yeah. That's a powerful moment that happens with God's people when they finally get it. For me, when I read that, I try to make the same emotional connection here and go like, hey, when am I going to finally get it? Sometimes I feel like I'm really close to it. Sometimes I can see my stubbornness and my self-will rising back up. But then you got to remember, everything that God has accomplished that is truly good in your life has come after you finally got it. You finally submitted and said, you know what? He's got this. I don't. He does. Anything you wish you knew more about? I got a long list of stuff. I want to know in particular exactly how the various nations as a group, how they emotionally responded to seeing this tribes of Israel come through. You think about that. This is not a small little traveling little pod of people, whatever number you want to ascribe to it. And you're living off in the middle of nowhere, your small little country, and this huge nation comes walking through. Look, we get excited when a new restaurant opens up in town, and we'll wait and like traffic stops. Could you imagine the experience there? And that's something I would love to actually, in the little small errata of things, I'd like to know that. That'd be interesting. More so, this last group that finally gets it, what happens to them as they spiritually forget it? Because by the end of Joshua, they have forgotten what they once knew. So I want to know what's ground on their souls in a way that has that final outcome. That's it for our time this morning, so we'll have to pause right here. We'll pick back up again and paying attention to this as we move forward. Remember, we'll be kind of around the beginning of Joshua next Sunday, but that's unfortunately going to also set us up to be soon in Judges. And if you remember the text of Judges, it's not a pleasant experience. And so some highs and lows on the forefront coming to us soon. Thanks, everybody.